Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to you wherever you are in the world. I am Tigress Osborn. I'm the chair of NAAFA, the National Association to Advance Fat Acceptance, and I am also host of the NAAFA webinar series. Welcome to the show today, folks. Happy Fat Liberation Month. We are so excited to have our first educational virtual activity of Fat Liberation Month be featuring the renowned Dr. Charlotte Cooper, who I will introduce to you in just a moment. And Dr. Cooper is the author of the book Fat Activism, a radical social movement. We're going to talk about her book and what else she's been up to. Before we do that, I just want to remind you all that as we celebrate Fat Liberation Month this August, we've got a lot of activities planned for you. Our activities, our reading suggestions, our other opportunities to learn and have fun together in Fat community are all listed on the NAAFA website at naafa.org/FLM, Fat Liberation Month. And you'll find a calendar there. You'll also find a place where you can learn more about the history of how and why we started this month last year and why we moved to August this year. And you'll see events sponsored by NAAFA. You'll see events sponsored by our partners who we work with directly, partner organizations. And then also just be aware that all over the world, there are other people celebrating in individual and collective ways. So keep an eye out for things that are not on our calendar, but that may be happening in your own live or virtual communities. We also want to give a shout out to artist Bats Langley, who designed our logo and artwork for Fat Liberation Month this year. If you haven't seen that yet, please take a look at any of our social media spaces. We are NAAFA official on your favorite social media, and you will see that fantastic art by Bats Langley. And I am calling in today, welcoming you into this virtual space from the physical space of Phoenix, Arizona, which is Autumn Land. We have often, for the last year or so, I think, invited people to share where they are from, including who the indigenous folks of that land are. And today I just want to acknowledge that one of our upcoming speakers brought to our attention that there is some debate in indigenous communities about whether land acknowledgements are a helpful and respectful way of helping people learn about whose land we're on, or whether they sort of reinforce an idea that those people used to be here and we're here now. So in the spirit of acknowledging wherever you are, we want to keep in mind that discussion within indigenous communities, and we want to honor the folks whose land we're on, and we want to make sure that we are also supporting those folks in contemporary ways with our time, our attention, and with our money. Many tribal folks have opportunities for giving to them directly through a land tax or through other kinds of giving. And certainly there are other ways you can get involved in learning more about the indigenous folks who are wherever you're at. So thank you for that. If you don't know whose lands you're on, we encourage you that the answer is a Google away. So please find out, please do what you can to support those communities. We're going to continue to do land acknowledgements for now as we further explore that dialogue with indigenous folks. And Dr. Cooper, you want to tell us where you are?
Yes. Well, I'm in London, in the UK. I'm in East London. And as to whose land I'm on, I'm pretty sure that I'm on the land of empire and colonization and slavery and white supremacy. And in naming this, I'm reaffirming my commitment to ending the harms caused by these atrocities. I'm in the ground zero of settler civilization.
Of colonization, right?
Yes.
Thank you for that acknowledgement. Before I get into more questions with Dr. Cooper, let me properly introduce her to all of you. Dr. Cooper is a fat activist, a scholar, and an author who lives and works in East London in the UK. That is where she's dialing in from today. She has a special interest in queering fat. We'll talk about what that means, fat feminism, and fat culture. And her theorizing of the social model of disability has been influential. Her most popular work is Fat Activism, Activism, a radical social movement. Charlotte is also a radical and accredited psychotherapist. She has a creative practice with roots in DIY culture, and she performs as Homosexual Death Drive. We're definitely going to talk about that. Charlotte is queer, working class, and neurodivergent. You can find out more at charlottecooper.net. Dr. Cooper, welcome to the NAAFA webinar series. We are so honored to have you.
Well, thank you, Tigress. I'm so delighted to be here. And the webinar series is so excellent. I feel humbled by the company that I'm in.
Thank you so much for that. And I know that we've had so much excitement about this webinar coming up. There are so many people in Fat Liberation community who value your work so deeply. Let's start by talking about how you came to be doing this work. How did you become a fat activist?
Oh, crikey. Well, it's funny. I had assumed I had been fat all my life, but actually I wasn't fat all my life. But in my family, I was positioned as fat. And this was seen as, you know, the worst of the worst, really. I come from a working class family, and my mum was a nurse, and she had a lot of anxiety around my body and around the ways that fatness gives away a kind of class identity. So I grew up with this, and I was also, I was incarcerated as a young person in a school and had experience of being starved there. And when I came out of there, I was a chubby child because, puberty happened and all kinds of things happened to my body. And so the kind of the fantasy or the prediction that I was fat started to come true. And it intrigued me from a really tender age, because I was interested in what being called fat and being fat meant, and why I was treated a certain way and other people weren't, and why it was seen as a bad thing. And luckily, I had access to feminist knowledge that helped explain that. So by the time I was in my mid-teens, 16 or so, I had a kind of very embryonic way of thinking about it and knowing about it. And so I started to talk to other people about it too. And I was really out on a limb, and I still feel out on a limb in many ways. But I started to talk about it, and I suppose that was the beginnings, really. And sometimes people were able to come along with me, and often they weren't. But always this question of like, why am I treated this way? What is it that's different about me? Why am I positioned in this way? What does it mean? Those were the core questions, and feminism helped me make sense of that. And also, I was a punk as well. That helped me make sense of it too, because there was a real kind of repudiation of the world of the normals. I didn't want to be normal, so I was interested in finding a way into life, through life, as myself, and not as something that I was all supposed to be. So those were the very early things. And of course, like everybody, I read Fat as a Feminist Issue because the title jumped out at me. But that book really messed with me, and I still I find it extremely problematic work, and not just that work, but the whole world of feminist psychoanalysis and the ways in which they position fat. So that was a problem. But around 1989 or so, in Britain, there was a group called the Fat Wins Group, and they put on a conference. And it had huge amounts of media attention. Now, I couldn't go to that conference because I was living far away, but I was really interested in this. And this was the first time that I could see a really coherent analysis of what was called then fat oppression, and a sort of a feminist response to that too. It was so exciting. I really wanted to be a part of that. That was electrifying to me. And there was a feminist press in the UK at that time as well. So there was a magazine called Spare Rib. And there was also a magazine called Trouble and Strife, which is Cockney rhyming slang for wife. And in these feminist media, people were starting to talk about fat in ways that really, really resonated with me. So that was the kind of the origins of it, I suppose, being bullied and finding a way through these odd ways. And also, I might say that I didn't really know about libraries when I was young. So I would go to bookshops, and I'd stand and read books every Saturday every Saturday afternoon. And the books that I was reading, well, first of all, I was interested in sex. So I'd go and read the books on sex education. And then next door to the books on sex education were the feminist books. I don't know why they put them together, but they did. And so I kind of gradually would work my way along the shelves. Luckily, the booksellers were very understanding. That's how I kind of started to find things out and educate myself and find out about the world.
And just as folks, before we started our recording today, we were talking about the importance of recommending Dr. Cooper's book and other FAT works to your local library. So please do, if you're a library supporter or if you want to become a library supporter, please do find out how you can suggest books to your favorite librarian and suggest Dr. Cooper's work and other books about FAT activism. We'll talk to Dr. Cooper about other books that influenced you as well. How did you go from that sort of personal awakening and understanding around all of these things to being a scholar who was studying this issue and the history of this movement so in depth?
So I've got quite a lot of higher education, and my undergraduate degree was in drama. So I'm still obviously really interested in performance. But I didn't really know how to make that work once the degree ended, and I did a load of dead end sort of jobs as a care worker or administrator. But I'd always enjoyed learning. That was important to me, and I thought, well, I'd quite like to do a master's degree. And at the time, education in the UK was really cheap, and it was possible for me on a very low income to go and do a master's. And I wanted to explore FAT. I knew that it was a burning question. What is it about? What might fat politics be? What if I could develop my ideas about this? And I was lucky enough to meet somebody called Jenny Corbett, who worked at the University of East London, and I did this strange course which was called independent study, basically. So we were supported to write our own courses and to do our own courses and to work independently, which is absolutely perfect and brilliant for me. So I worked with Jenny, whose special area was in disability, and she introduced me to the social model of disability. And she said, hey, Charlotte, there may be some mileage in this. You might want to think about applying this theory to FAT. And so with her support, I did that. And so I've written this book, Fat Activism, but my first book, which I'm going to wave in front of you now, is this one. It's called Fat and Proud, The Politics of Size. So this came out of that master's degree. And it's basically me theorising the social model of disability for people. It's out of print now, but I'm hoping to produce a version of it, a new edition of it, sometime in the next year or so. So that's how it shifted. I was very lucky at the time to be born at the time that I was born, to benefit from really cheap education and to be able to do this really amazing master's with somebody whose work I respected and who could see something in me. That was unusual for me. So I think that's probably one of the best experiences of education I've ever had. And that's when those ideas took root. But, I became very burnt out after that. I was living quite an underclass existence and, in quite a bad way because I'd been through some traumatic experiences. So the book came out and, I just sort of burnt out and took a different direction and needed to find a way of making a living. So I learned how to make websites and went into tech for a while. And then I didn't realise it, but people had surprisingly enough been reading the book, and I found myself in the early 2000s. I went to a conference because even though I was burnt out, I was still interested in FAT, and I do consider it a life's interest, a life's work. And so I went to a conference, and someone came up to me and said, "Are you Charlotte Cooper?" Which flummoxed me so much because that never happens. And I said, "Oh, yeah, I am." And she invited me to some other gatherings. These were academic conferences. Mm-hmm. And it turned out that other people were also building some of their work on the back of Fat and Proud and on the back of this theorising the social model. And that was really exciting. And also around that time, I found out about No Lose, which is a kind of conference organisation originally for fat lesbians, but now open to fat queers of all kinds, and trans and non-binary people. And reconnected with people that I'd met. Oh my God, so many little tentacles here, who I'd met through Fat Girl as well, who I'd also been writing for in the early 90s. So I have scholarship, but I also have this history of kind of alternative press and DIY and other ways of knowing too. So yeah, it all kind of came together with No Lose. So yeah, I don't know. It's a funny kind of bumpy ride, Tigress. I've been around for a long time, and I've really been all over the place. So there's the social model, there's the queer stuff in Fat Activism. You know, there's my therapeutic work, there's the DIY. I'm interested in technology and also performance and somatics and movement. So I've got a really broad practice. I'm sometimes known for scholarship, but I'm also not really in the scholarly world anymore as well. I consider myself more of a para-academic, somebody who's sort of takes a critical position outside the university. So it's a real mixed bag with me. That's why it's quite difficult to sort of sum it up. It's quite a sprawling practice, I suppose.
Well, that's what's great about getting to hear about it, though, because I think, especially for folks who are new to fat liberation movement, the sort of like getting to see a variety of examples of what that can look like, what it can look like in your personal life, what it can look like in, collective spaces and organizing, I think is really important. You mentioned getting involved in tech and learning to make websites. Is that how you ended up creating the Obesity Time Bomb?
Yeah, a little bit. I mean, social media happened a little bit after that. I learned to code by hand, which seems completely ludicrous now. And also my tech skills are really, they're kind of carbon dated to 1999 or 2000 or so. So, I wouldn't like to be dropped in a pool of code these days. But no, what that enabled me to do was to have money. Actually, it was the first time in my life I'd had money, and money enabled me to travel and to see different people and to have a different kind of life. And it also enabled me not to work all the time because I earned a good hourly rate, and it meant that I could go and do my therapy training. It meant that I could, write a chapter for a book. It just gave me the time and space to be, to be myself a bit more. That's been a lifelong sort of journey as well, working and making a living and surviving, but also trying to make space for all the other stuff that I want to do in my life too. As a working class person, I don't have a private income. I've got to bring home the bacon myself. So I suppose that's what tech gave me. But as for Obesity Time Bomb, I mean, yeah, I've taken it offline for the moment because I needed a bit of time to think about it. But it probably will be online again at some point. But when I got the offer to do a scholarship, to do a PhD, I got a scholarship to do that, and that was based on all the publishing that I had done. So I'd published some scholarly papers, but I'd also done a lot of journalism, and and I think of Fat and Proud as being accessible scholarship. I needed a place where I could explore ideas. And so blogging was available to me at that time. And so I just went ahead. But, it turns out I really like blogging. And I really like sort of short form writing a lot. And it lasted for about 10 years and it included lots of other stuff. But mostly it was a place where I could think about things, document what was going on in my world. Create a sort of a little body of work, I suppose. And I loved calling it Obesity Time Bomb as well, because it was taking a name that had been used against us and sort of turning it around. And I especially loved it when thin people in my world couldn't quite bring themselves to say the title of it. So they call it things like Your Time Bomb Blog without using the O word, which always really amused me.
I love that use of the O word, for folks who are sort of new to the dialogue around whether we should or should not use the words overweight and obesity. We always want to be thinking about overweight, establishing the concept in people's mind that there is a certain weight that you can be over her. And so, we avoid that one often in fat liberation communities for that reason. And we avoid obesity because of the way that it pathologizes fat people and creates a disease model of being fat. But whenever we can use it in those sort of like throwing it back in the face of the haters kind of ways, like the obesity time bomb blog, or like, the glorifying obesity hashtag, that terminology that gets used against us, we do embrace the word in that kind of way, in that kind of usage.
I think of it as obesity with this business going on around it as well. And one of the things I loved about that blog was, for a long time, if anybody searched or Googled obesity time bomb, they'd end up with me. They wouldn't end up with some hate-filled nonsense from somewhere else. So I really enjoyed taking that space.
Yeah, that's beautiful. It's I know that the time bomb was the first place that I encountered your work, and I think probably the first place that I learned about the Fat Underground. Can you talk about their influence on your work?
Well, their influence is massive on me, and I'm not sure, where did I first hear? Okay, so the first the stuff that was going on in the UK around 89 or so was really important to me, but the work that really made my heart sing was the stuff that I found in a book called Shadow on a Tightrope. I would say this is like the number one radicalizing influence on my life. Do you have it on your shelf?
I do.
Yeah, of course you do. There it is. An absolutely brilliant anthology. And now then, where am I going with this? I've lost my thread, Tigress. What was I saying? What was the question?
The question was about discovering the Fat Underground.
Yeah, that's right. So some of the papers in Shadow on a Tightrope. So Shadow on a Tightrope was published in 1983, but some of the material in it had been written much, much earlier, and it was written by somebody called Vivian Mayer, who also went by other names. So during Fat Underground era, which would have been sort of the early 70s. She was known as Aldebaran, and more lately she's known as Sarah Fishman. And her writing was so electrifying. It really excited me to think that people were thinking about fat in this way. Also included in that book was the Fat Liberation Manifesto, which again, I mean, it still gives me chills when I read it these days as well. So this was just, hugely exciting to read this stuff and to read this kind of radical, anti-oppressive, intersectional, although they didn't include disability, sadly, in the manifesto. They included other ways of seeing things. Plus, as Judy Freespirit told me, there were socialists as well. So there was left-leaning aspect to them that I really, really loved. And over the years, they seem like this kind of mythical organization. And I suppose my work has been to uncover more and more about the Fat Underground as time has gone by. Karen Stinson's largesse archive was instrumental in that, and she published some things. I suppose that would have been the early to mid 90s that she was publishing things as part of that project. And you can now find that work via the Fat Liberation Archive that Max Airborne and Tracy Tidwell have been pulling together. But yeah, that work was just so exciting to me. They were so naughty. They would turn up to things and create mayhem. They did lots of kind of performative work. They did small kind of consciousness raising things with, meeting and talking. They had also come from this sort of radical therapy background as well, which I'm interested in, and I'm doing a bit of research about that now and hope to publish on that, whenever it's written. So they just seem so multifaceted. I really like their attitude. I thought it was just really exciting to me that could exist. And I think I'm just really obsessed with them. I'm afraid. I think the Fat Underground is my hobby. So I'm interested in any material relating to the Fat Underground. There was a video that was made. I know the Gay and Lesbian Historical Center organization in San Francisco has a copy of it. There is a version of it that I was part of putting online. Just sort of seeing them and hearing their process, that stuff. It's dated in some ways, but also it's still so prescient and incisive and sharp. I love the way that they they did their own research as well, that they made a world of their own, I think. And that's hugely exciting to me, that kind of making a livable life, a world of your own, a world in which you can exist, a collective world, a world that has connections to all kinds of other politics as well. This thrills me. And to think that that was going on in the early 70s, and, you know, that I wouldn't be here without that work is, that humbles me a lot.
Their work really shapes our discussions about intersectionality in NAAFA in the contemporary NAAFA period. You know, we know that one of the shortcomings of historical NAAFA was often the lack of intersectional lens, and to know that right in the Fat Liberation Manifesto, there's this declaration of seeing ourselves in alignment with other social justice movements, with other anti-oppression causes, and with other oppressed groups is really important. So I talk about their work a lot, especially about that point of the manifesto. But friends, if you're unfamiliar with the Fat Manifesto, as Dr. Cooper said, you know, you can find it in Shadow on the Tightrope. You can Shadow on a Tightrope, and this book is still easily available for purchase online. Another one you should recommend to your library. And you can also find that video that Dr. Cooper mentioned on YouTube. If you just go to YouTube and look for the Fat Underground, you will find that archival footage. And I put, for those of you who are with us live in the chat, the link to the Fat Liberation Archive that Dr. Cooper just mentioned, that Max and Tracy are working on. You also talked about Fat Girl magazine, and I know a lot of the beginning of the archive is around getting all of those Fat Girl magazines digitally available to folks. So please do check it out. It's fatlibarchive.org. Let's shift to talking a little bit more about intersectionality and how it has and has not shown up in the history of fat activism. You talk about queering fat activism. What do you mean by that?
What do I mean? Oh gosh, how to explain queer? Because queer is talked of as this is going to melt your brain, an anti-identity, and there's so much really dense theory associated with it. But what I think of as queering is doing things a bit weirdly, doing things in a way that that's about not assimilating, that's also a bit kind of down and dirty as well, that has this kind of otherness and a different sorts of sensibility to it. It's for me, it's a non-mainstream way of looking at things. And also for me, it does, it kind of complements my own neurodivergence, which is also about looking at things in a skewed and odd and experiencing things weirdly kind of way. So I think of queering for activism as an activism that is not necessarily about wanting to be part of a mainstream, but is about creating lots of different possibilities for all kinds of people, for fat people, for every kind of person. And when I think of queering activism, it makes me think about activism in general. And when I started the research for the Fat Activism book, the kind of view that the main view would be that activism was, marching down the street with a placard, doing work on committees, writing to government, changing laws, those kinds of things. Now, those things are activism, and no shame on any of those things. They're massively important, but there are lots of different ways of doing activism. And so in the book, I talk about the ways that activism can manifest through creative work, through making community, and through these kind of very sort of strange moments as well. So I theorize that activism can be, having a bad thought, or, choosing to walk down the street eating an ice cream, or doing something that might have a regrettable outcome, or fat activism that fails, or fat activism that refuses normativity in some way. So by queering it, I think about fat activism as being a whole range of things and not a very kind of narrow delineated thing. And in doing that, it means that more people can adopt it as something that they do. Because one of the things I came across when I was talking to people during the research period would be people who I think are, hugely important fat activists would say things like, "Oh no, I'm not an activist," and it would make me fall off my chair, because these are people who had massive activist practices and community and world making around them. So that's the stuff that I wanted to get to. Frankly, I love it all. Any kind of action supporting the right to live of fat people, I'm for that. And one of the misreadings of my work is that I think that fat activism is somehow better than other kinds of activism. But the truth is, I think there are loads and loads of different sorts of fat activism, and loads of different ways of looking at fat. There are different threads and lineages, and the more the merrier, I think. But what I don't want is that one takes precedence over the other. I think they all have a space, and I'm really into that kind of the multiplicity of voices, and the inclusion that generates too. The idea that anybody really can be an activist. It doesn't mean that you have to know a lot of people, be able to write a letter, be a respectable kind of person either. So I think queering is a fancy way of saying inclusive.
Mm-hmm. And so we don't have to self-identify as queer to be queering fat activism.
No, not at all. It's a verb, and also, honestly, there are convoluted debates about what queer is, who queer is, what queer behaviour is. Is it an identity? Is it a set of actions? Is it a lens that you see things through? I mean, don't worry about it. Don't worry about it. Just do the things that you do to make a life for yourself, to make a livable life. I think that's what queering for activism means to me.
Well, and so many of us are most familiar with the term queer as it relates to LGBTQIA politics, and you've done some really important work about documenting the role of those queer folks in the history of fat activism. Will you talk a little bit about that and about the timeline you developed at No Lose?
Yeah. Oh, okay. So, you can see pictures and stuff behind me but I'm sitting in my office at home, and what you can't see are 1, 2, 3, 4 shelves of my archive, and each shelf must be about, I don't know, 10 feet long. So there's a lot of stuff here, and this is just my stuff. So I'm interested, very, very interested actually, in the ways that stories get lost, critical stories, crucial stories. And I noticed as well over the years that every fat activist feels as though they're the first person that's ever thought about this stuff. Babe, you are not. There are many, many people who have come before you. And the problem is we're not in touch with those stories and those histories. So I feel really passionate about creating some kind of continuity around that. And also, as I get older, I'm really interested in these intergenerational conversations too. I think they're so, so, so important.
Yes.
So the Timeline Project, I don't even know how it started. But anyway, I got there was a No Lose. I think when was this? 2010. There was a No Lose in 2010. And there was an invitation to put on a workshop. And now I'm a bit of a show off. So I thought, oh yeah, I'd love to do a workshop. And what will I do? Oh, I know. Perhaps we can make a timeline. So this is as simple as this. I got a roll of wallpaper, plain wallpaper, and I stuck it up on the wall at a level that people could reach. And I gave everybody pens, and we marked off decades on this paper. And for an hour, I invited everybody to write moments from their fat lives, from their fat biographies or their fat communities or fat activisms that they had done that were meaningful to them. And over the course of this hour, this thing grew. It was absolutely amazing. And it was wonderful to see everybody engage with it. The older people who had older memories at one end, moving up to the newbies at the other. So we created this really, really beautiful object together. And I thought, okay, well, what to do with this now? And because I've got this practice of making zines and doing alternative publishing, I thought, oh, I know, I'll make a zine out of this, and take the information out of it and make it into something that people can use. So I made a zine. What did I do? I went on an artist residence in Hamburg in Germany, where they gave me a room and time. So I went there and I made a zine out of out of this timeline. And there's also a really fantastic archive there called Build Vexel. And I thought it would be really great to lodge this, the actual object of the timeline in this archive so that other people could see it, and also that it wouldn't be necessarily an Anglo-centric archive. It was a different kind of queer and feminist and trans-friendly archive, that different sorts of people would encounter it there. And then, I made the zine available online. I ended up writing a scholarly paper about it. And it became one of those kind of touchstone projects for me, because it was something that transformed each time. So it was a workshop, it was this object, it was an archival object, it was a homemade publication, it was a download, it was a audio recording, it was a scholarly paper, and the sort of the central idea around making histories, writing your own histories and sharing that and documenting it and making that collectively as well, seemed to take off. And since then, people have used, and I've used this format in other spaces too. So I think 2013, we made one in Brussels, in Belgium. I know other activists have used this model as well for creating histories. And I think for me, the crucial part of this project is that we write our own histories, that we own that, that we don't depend on other people to write it and inevitably get it wrong. And that history doesn't have to be like one story. It can be many, many different stories, and they can contradict. And but the issue is to make these stories and try and make them available in whatever way we can. I don't know. Does that answer your question?
Yes, and this timeline is available on your website,
yes,
cooper.net, and there's some video also of where you can see the actual timeline on the wall.
Yeah.
So, friends, you should check that out. We have about 20 more minutes with Dr. Cooper, so if you're with us live today and you have questions, you can go ahead and start entering your questions in the chat. It's very helpful if you actually put the word question in capital letters before your question, so that if the chat starts popping off, I can still see your questions out there. While we give people a minute to do that, Dr. Cooper, I just want to ask you about your first encounters with us. Where did you first learn about NAAFA, and how does NAAFA fit into the history of fat activism from your perspective?
Well, NAAFA is obviously a giant of the movement, as you know. And how I first came about NAAFA, now then, I think somebody gave me a packet of news. So this would have been when I was studying for my master's degree. Somebody gave me a packet of NAAFA newsletters from the early 90s. And I just remember sitting on the floor and reading them and being transfixed that this world existed. Now, it was a world that was very different to my own. And this was a world of pool parties and committees and special interest groups and fat admirers. And, it was very different to the world that I inhabited. But it was super fascinating to see that this world existed. And it was also for me, a very North American world as well. So it was very different to what I understood on how people organised here in the UK. So I found that absolutely compelling. And over the years, let's see what happened then. I just knew it existed, and I was interested. I would see that there would be, because NAAFA was so visible as an organisation, it would often pop up in sociological texts that I was reading around fat. There was something else I was going to say about that, about NAAFA and where it went. Oh, I know what it was. So at the same time, I was part of this thing called Living Large. Honestly, the names of these things just break my heart. So Living Large was what was called an APA-zine, which was a very strange publication. And what it would be be that there would be a number of people who would eat. I suppose it was like a pre-blog kind of, or pre-message board kind of way of communicating. And what we would do I think it was every quarter, we would all write like a little piece, a piece of a couple of pages perhaps, and the thing would have a little a title or a heading, and you would send it to a central mailer, and they would copy it and they would send it out to people. So you'd end up getting this thing that was like a newsletter where you could talk between yourselves as well. And so you maybe share your news or say what was on your mind or talk about FAT, but you also would include some responses to other people's newsletters as well. And it would come together in this little publication that would drop through your mailbox once every quarter. And there were some people involved with NAAFA on that, and they were so helpful in acclimatizing me to that culture and that world and that way of viewing fat. I feel sad really that Living Large is a forgotten phenomenon, because it was a really wonderful community to be part of, a very mixed community. So that's how I knew about NAAFA. And then, of course, as time went by, I started to write about NAAFA as well. I was doing my own research about it. I was developing research skills. I came to the conference in 2009 and met a lot of interesting people. And I've always been interested in the histories of NAAFA because of its relationship to the fat underground as well, and because of these different sort of lineages of fat too. And it's interesting, and exciting to me, the way that those lines and those threads, the way that they relate to each other now.
And in your book, you talk about how NAAFA becomes, for many people, a proxy for fat activism. Can you explain what that means and talk about what is good or bad or otherwise about NAAFA being a proxy for fat activism?
Yes, I suppose what I mean is what I personally would resist is that fat activism is one thing, and it can only be one thing. So it can only be body positivity, it can only be NAAFA, it can only be fashion, it can only be the things that are perhaps the most visible. Because my take, as I was saying earlier, is I think fat activism is multifaceted, infinite. And I love all that expansiveness of it, and I don't want that to be shut down. So that's what I think the danger is of assuming that fat activism is just one thing, and that one thing becomes a proxy for it. And NAAFA, I think, because it's so visible, it does become the place that journalists go to, that researchers go to, that people who aren't of the world that we're in move in on as the thing. In much the same way that I've read countless ethnographies of slimming clubs, because they think that's the people doing that research think that's the only place where fat people ever get together. So I'm interested in a multiplicity of fat voices, fat discourse, ways of knowing and being fat, and not reducing. I'm a kind of anti-reductionist, I think.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Bill Fabry, who is the credited founder of NAAFA, and co-founded the organization with Lou Lauterbach, as I know that you know this history, Charlotte, but some of our audience does not. Mm-hmm. So NAAFA's origin story, for those of you who are new to this, is that Bill was inspired in part by an article that Lou Lauterbach published in the Saturday Evening Post here in the U.S. And the Fat In, which was a Steve Post, a radio DJ in New York, created this fat, it was almost like a flash mob, but it was something between a flash mob and a festival, right? In Central Park, with hundreds of people who showed up. And so those two things were very inspiring to Lou. And Lou was a thin man with a fat wife who he adored, Joyce Fabry. And started this organization. And Bill is with us today, and Bill has a question in the chat. His question is, did you ever get a chance to meet Lou Lauterbach? After the conference with ASDA and NAAFA in 2009?
Yes, I did, Bill. I did. I went to Staten Island, and I sat and talked with him for an hour or so. And he was a very sweet and loving person. It was totally exciting meeting him. And we talked about something, because he started off, he called himself a hack writer. And I think he was, I don't know, a bit too self-effacing with that. But we talked a lot about his fiction. So he wrote a book called Operation Moon Rocket, and we talked about that. And he wrote also a book which I've got it up on my shelf, but I can't remember the name of it, which had a kind of James Bond type figure in it as well. So yeah, we talked about that. He helped clarify some of the earlier the earlier ways, which of course you will know because you were there, Bill, the ways in which NAAFA was formed and some of the dynamics that went on with that. And I will say, actually, and we continued a correspondence as well for some time after that too. But I will say that talking to people and talking to people directly and interviewing and recording oral histories is certainly one of the pleasures of my life as a researcher into fat. And I suppose I want to take a moment to encourage more people to do it, because it's brilliant to sit and talk with somebody and to be curious about their lives and to be curious about how they got into fat and how things what they did, what people did, because it's not always straightforward, and it's not always the people that you expect as well who do the stuff.
Yeah, I have to echo that it's one of the things that is most valuable to me about this work is getting to talk to people who are the grand elders and the forebearers of this work, and folks are very generous with their time with me. I just reach out to people, as I did with you, like, hey Kate, what do you think about NAAFA? Can we talk about that sometime? Or what do you not think about NAAFA? Like, why did you not think about NAAFA at all, and how does that fit in with what we should be doing as an organization? And people are very generous with their time. If you have fat elders in your community, and you have fat activist elders in your community, gather their stories and listen to them, and and I'm using elder as broadly as as people self-identify, or as you identify folks who are of generations that came before you. So there's another question in the chat, which is about noting that you've been talking a lot about things that influenced you in the 90s, which is also when Rigel came into fat activism, the person asking the question, and they want to know what is happening now, and where can they find active blogs or newsletters or magazines? Are there things that you recommend, Charlotte, now?
I'm such an old fart that I wouldn't be able to tell you. I'm the wrong person to tell you what's going on now. You need to talk to somebody who's 25 to find out what's going on now. What's going on now is I'm sitting at my computer and I'm writing and I'm archiving and I'm thinking and I'm researching as much as I can. But that is not very exciting for most people. You don't want to be sitting in here in the room with me watching me do that. It's too dull. What is happening now is, this is going to sound so cringy, but it's what you make. You reach out to people, you look out for names. There isn't a list or a central repository of people doing stuff. It's super diverse. Fat activism isn't a coherent or cohesive thing. Google, see what you can find. I mean, there are certainly people whose work is great, but mostly I'm really kind of focused on my own stuff and doing my work. So I'm actually really the wrong person to be asking about what's going on now, because I don't know. I don't know what's going on. I read things, I find things, but mostly I'm pursuing my own interests here.
I think one of the best ways to find self-made media is to use fat positive hashtags on social media to identify people who are creating their own things, who are, inventing a world of fat visibility. One of my favorite hashtags is literally "fat visibility is activism." And I think it kind of speaks to what you were saying, Dr. Cooper, about the sort of like everything we do, right? If you show up as your fat self anywhere, that's already radical, because the world doesn't want us to show up as our fat selves unapologetically, or even, but there's this saying about, like, it says, I don't remember who said it, but something like speak loud even if your voice quivers. It's this sort of same thing about, showing up even if you're not sure about showing up. Just by showing up as your fat self, you've already engaged in activism. So I think that so I definitely think, and maybe those of you who are with us live, put some of your favorite hashtags in the chat as places where those who engage with social media can find connection or find good content. Where
I get it, Tigress, is at my kitchen table with my mates, with the people I already know. So I'm not, I suppose it is that intergenerational thing. I'm not at the life stage where I'm out there looking for new stuff, because I feel like I have plenty to be getting on with, actually, and I'm not looking necessarily for the latest things. I've got ideas and things that I want to develop myself. So, yeah, my kitchen table is basically it.
Yeah, and that's so you say in your biography that you are a fan of DIY culture. Can you give us an example of something that started at your kitchen table that is now available for other people?
Yes, I can. Thanks for that. So I was just picking some things off my shelf here, and I made this thing in 2016 called Fat Activist Vernacular, which is a zine. Look, it's a homemade little thing printed cheaply, and it's a kind of, I'm interested in dictionaries, so I kind of made a dictionary of words that I thought and concepts that I thought were relevant to fat people. So and I like to make things funny as well, because pleasure is super important, and without it you burn out much more quickly. So I just had things like death, fat, denial, cuddly, crumbs, and I have little definitions of them as well. So crumbs, fat people are often satisfied with crumbs. Or what else have I got? Greed, the belief that fat people always want more than everybody else, and that this is very unfair and horrible to behold. Gut barging, a type of wrestling involving attacking someone with your belly. Lovely and slim, the opposite of to fat and ugly. Ending up like that, an expression of fear, ignorance, pity, and disgust directed by the normals towards fat, old, and disabled people, or any combination thereof. So it's rather a sort of sharp-tongued homemade dictionary. And this is the paper version, which is sold out now, but there's a digital version that you can buy online on my website if you want to. So that's an example, I suppose, of a little DIY project that started off as me and my mates talking crap and around my kitchen table and making something sort of silly, but I like things that are silly and serious at the same time. That really, really gets me off. So the Fat Activist Vernacular is a prime example of that homemade dictionary of fat concepts. Yeah, I suppose written from a fat point of view, what if that can exist, or written from my fat point of view, in a way that might illuminate fat people or fat lives as a cultural thing. That's another thing I'm interested in as well. The idea that being fat, that there is such a thing as fat culture too, because of course to the world of the normals and the world of the medics and the obesity industrial complex, the idea that we might have culture or history or even relationships to each other or personhood or stories to tell is completely beyond the pale. So I'm very much interested in developing the idea that fat culture exists, that it has existed for a long time, and that we're busy making culture as all the time.
Yes. Yes, we are busy making culture all the time.
Mm-hmm.
So last question from the chat, and then we'll start to wrap up. John wants to thank you for all your work, first of all, and wants to know about public health community and things they can do. So it says the public health community is still stuck in a medical perspective of fat bodies and the relationship between fat and adverse health outcomes. What are your ideas about how public health researchers and organizations can support health and well-being for fat people and move away from the disease model? Is the social model of disability enough, or are there other things we need to do? Dr. Cooper, will you just say a little bit about what the social model of disability means for people who are familiar with that?
I'd be delighted to. So a book by Mike Oliver that came out in 94, I think, in the UK, called The Politics of Disablement. I think he was one of the first people to coin this term, the social model. And he talks about different models, different ways of understanding what it is to be disabled. So one way is a medical model, that disability is seen as primarily a medical problem, and that doctors and medics are the ones to resolve this. He also talks about charity models as well, where disabled people are, pitiful recipients of charity. And then he also talks about this thing called the social model, which is about transforming those earlier ways of understanding disability, or those counter ways of understanding disability, by saying that actually you don't need to change, because the underlying assumption is that one would rather be normal, that you don't, that being normal is extremely overrated and not possible for many of us. And the things that actually hold disabled people back are things like attitudes, physical barriers, inaccessible environments, and so forth. And so my theorizing of the social model of disability around fat is also about changing attitudes, thinking about access, thinking what that looks like for fat people. So I think that's actually an important way of that people in public health might get on board with it. But I also do struggle with institutions, and with these large institutions that public health organisations often are, because my work is quite illegible to them, and it's a real kind of opposite land piece of work to try and translate the things that I'm interested in and that I think keep me alive and keep me well into things that might work within a public health setting. And I'm also worried about things that I really treasure being appropriated and transformed into something far from what I wanted them to be originally. So it does feel like a dance with power, actually, those kinds of conversations. I would be thinking about creating projects and showing people who in the public health world, how those projects work, and making projects that actually do support the well-being of fat people. To create some examples. I suppose I'd be thinking of it from that point of view, rather than going in and trying to provide counter arguments, because you can come up with all the arguments in the world, but I do think that the problem of fat phobia, fat oppression, anti-fatness is it's a struggle for power, and I do think that you can have the right information, but people who are invested in those power relationships aren't going to want to listen to that. That sounds pretty heavy, doesn't it? There you go. I don't know if that's a good enough answer for you, but yeah, I think it's a difficult one. But I also think it's critical, because is my life going to be my lifespan going to be shorter because I was fat, and because the health services available to me are fat phobic? I mean, that's serious stuff.
It is serious stuff. And one of the things that I will also bring up in relation to this question, you mentioned the idea of things that are beloved to us, or things that have been important in our work, being appropriated or co-opted. And, we're seeing all the time now anti-obesity organizations that are touting themselves as fighting weight stigma. So I think one of the things that people in public health can definitely do is resist that usage of the term weight stigma, where these medical organizations and anti-obesity groups, are really talking about fighting weight stigma only so far as to get fat people into the medical office so that we can be treated for our so-called disease of obesity. And so as long as they are, they're utilizing that terminology that we think they're part of creating weight stigma, but they're sort of twisting that narrative. So I think any resistance that those of you in the public health fields can create to that is really, really important. So I'm going to ask this last juicy question from the chat, and then we'll wrap up. I would like to ask you, Saul says, I would like to ask you about your opinion on fat sexuality.
What do you mean by fat sexuality? That could be anything. That's too broad. You've got to narrow that question down, and then I'll give you a juicy answer.
Okay, so I'll narrow that question down so we can get a juicy answer from Dr. Charlotte Cooper. Bill wants to know if you think that us being a thorn in the side of the obesity industrial complex is one of the measures of success in our movement.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. Yes. Continue being a thorn. Those people need to be jabbed and pricked and annoyed and irritated by us, to say the least.
I don't see any expansion on the sexuality question. Do you want to take
well.
it as a broad question?
Okay, fat sexuality.
Oh wait, here it is. Here it is.
Oh, here we go.
I mean, being fat and exploring sexuality. Do you think that fat people experience sexuality in a different way than thin people do?
Oh, in a different way. Well, that's interesting because some people have theorized that fat is queer and that fat sex must therefore be queer sex as well. But of course, fat people have sex, yes. And I hope you're having the sex that you like to, question asker.
Okay, so we always end with just asking our guest, is there anything that we didn't ask you about today that you would like to make sure that we get on record as part of this documenting of fat activist history?
Yes, there's one thing that I wanted to ask, which is, Tigress, you have a history of as a dancer, and I also have a dance and movement practice. And I just want to say how much I love that, and love that somebody who is a dancer is working in NAAFA, and also that I've enjoyed many times, accounts of NAAFA performance, performance at NAAFA. There does seem to be quite a lot of dance and movement and performance going on at NAAFA. But I'm especially delighted that you are a dancer. And I just wanted to say that dance, which is a fairly recent practice for me, I guess since maybe about for the last 10 years, I've been much more involved in dance and performance and movement and somatics and understanding my body and exploring my body through that. I really, really love it. And hoping for more of that, and hoping for more of that for you too.
Thank you. That is a hashtag, y'all, that you can definitely check out on fat on fat social media, on fat Twitter, fat Instagram. There are hashtags: fat dance, fat dancer. Any weight can 5, 6, 7, 8. So there are lots of fun fat dance hashtags as ways that you can connect with other people who are fat and dancing. And certainly there are lots of fat dancers on TikTok as well. So y'all can find some of those people. The final comment in the chat is just a thank you, and I want to share that because it echoes what we, I think, all feel about you and your work. It says, this is from Stephanie, and it says, I'd like to thank you for your work. It has hugely inspired me and my fat activism and work. I particularly love your concept that the continuous demand that we be healthy is totally misleading and ableist. We thank you for that aspect of your work, for all of your perspectives, for being part of helping document fat culture and fat history in this way, through your book and in all the other ways that you have done so. One more time, tell folks where they can find you online.
Yeah, find me online at charlottecooper.net. I'm also on Instagram. I've got such a weird Instagram name. Sorry about that. It's The Beefer, TheBeefer. I'll put it in the chat. And I don't do much in the way of social media. So that's where you'll find me. I don't post very often. I'm not a prolific person. But you can also, email me if you want to talk to me. I like to hear from people. I like to hear what people are up to. That's where you can find me.
Thank you so much for your time today. Thank you to our friends at Pro Bono ASL for helping us make our webinars accessible in that way. Our interpreters today were Susan and Ashley. You can find out more about Pro Bono ASL at probonoasl.com. And just a reminder to everyone, we offer our webinar series free to the global community. We are able to do that through the generous support of donors and contributors like all of you. When you share about the webinars, when you invite other folks, when you give to NAAFA so that we can help cover the cost of producing these webinars and having our fabulous guests and having our fabulous interpreters, you really are helping create more documentation of fat culture and fat history. So we thank those of you who are already doing that. If you'd like to become someone who is doing that, please go to naafa.org/give. Once again, on behalf of the entire NAAFA board and all of us in fat community, Dr. Cooper, we thank you for your work and thank you for being with us today.
Thank you.
We should dance out together.
All right.
since we had a little fat dance moment. All right. Thanks everyone for being with us. We will see you on Friday for our next webinar, which features the Brina Jean, who is going to be talking about fat visibility and lipedema visibility, especially from the perspective of a fat Black queer femme. So please join us for that webinar on Friday, and check our website for more upcoming Fat Liberation Month activities. Thanks everyone. Take care.
Bye.